Tell us your name and your hometown.
My name is Chancy, and I grew up and still live in Dothan, Alabama. Came back there after my tour with the Marine Corps, and didn't find a better place in the world I wanted to live, so I came back home.
Tell us how you got into the Marine Corps and how that all came about.
Well, I was, of course, on a farm and picking peanuts and hoeing cotton and those kind of things. It was awfully hot out there. I'd see these aircraft flying overhead, and I decided pretty quickly that probably farming was not going to be a good profession, and I decided to go to college at a small college, Chipola Junior College, which wasn't very far from where I grew up. And towards the end of the 2 years, a Navy recruiter came around, obviously, and asked us if we wanted to fly airplanes. And I thought that would be a wonderful thing to do, and I signed up, and he took us down to New Orleans, took a battery of tests, and a few of us passed the test, and we were off to Pensacola.
And after you got down to Pensacola, did you go right away into, how long were you there, and did you go into helicopters right away? Or?
No, actually the first 16 weeks, of course, is academics and the military aspects orientation. And then you get the opportunity to begin flying. My first flying was out at Softly Field in the 34. And it was, we spent, I believe, about 13 flights there before we were able to solo. And after solo and a little more time in the T-34, I went out to Whiting Field and started flying the T-28 for tactics and formation and a little more advanced work. And spent some time there, completed the work at Whiting Field, and then went to Barron Field for the carrier qualifications, field carrier qualifications. The carrier happened not to be in the area at the time, so I didn't get to hit the carrier in the training command. From there, I moved on to Memphis for advanced training in instruments. Flew the T-33. T2V actually it was, because it was the two-seated version that was configured for instrumentation. Spent, don't remember how long, maybe a month or 6 weeks or so, doing nothing but flying under the hood, and never saw anything outside of the landing area and the runways. And then from there to real advanced training out into Corpus Christi, or Chase Field, actually in Beeville, Texas, and flew the Grumman Ironworks F9F, first swept wing aircraft that was used, and it was a lead sled. It was a very durable airplane. And there we, of course, found training in it. Did a lot of formation and tactics flying, bombing runs and gun runs and that sort of thing, and then had some more instrument training. A lot of the time it was with an instructor, a lot of times it was in the single-seater version of it. Really enjoyed that particular part of the training command. I got, they had some problems with the F9 that grounded them for a long period of time. And when they started coming back up one at a time, I was fortunate enough to be near the end of my training, and they concentrated on moving those people out of the way. So I flew every day. Everybody else, a lot of them were sitting around waiting for another airplane to come up. I got all the syllabus because they began to cut flights out of the syllabus. So you had to complete the syllabus before you were designated. I was a NAVCAD, by the way. I was not an officer when I went through a flight training program. And I got all the syllabus completed. I needed about 3 or 4 more hours to get the required flying time. So I was scheduled the next day to fly wherever I wanted to and come back with at least 3.5 hours, and I would get my commission and get designated. I came in the next morning and saw my name up on the board, and I was a very happy man, boy, actually. And all of a sudden, in comes a clerk, and he scratches my name off, and I was right at the top. I was number one. And I asked, "What's going on here?" He said, "You need to go over to admin." And so I went over to admin, and they said, I walked in, and there was a whole bunch of sad-faced folks in there, NAVCADs, and a couple of Marine officers. And they said, "Marine Corps needs helicopter pilots. All you folks are going back to Ellison Field in Pensacola. And oh, by the way, it's group travel, and so don't expect any pay to go down there." We all had bought a car, of course. So you pay your way down there, you go down to Ellison Field, and all you prospective hot jockey fighter pilots go down there and fly helicopters. A lot of dissatisfied people got down there and flew the HTL 13, Bell 13. And then the old HUP, which had absolutely no hydraulic augmentation whatsoever. It was from the hands to the rotor system. And it was the most difficult airplane I have ever flown, but managed to master it, get through helicopter training, graduated, and then went out to New River, North Carolina.
So you got into helicopters at New River, and were you still in 34s at that time?
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead here. I went to the West Coast. I went to Santa Ana, and I got into a composite squadron. They had the old HRS-3 and the HOK, I believe it was, made by Cayman. It had the intermeshing rotors at an angle, and I flew those with HMM 363, and had a lot of fun. Really, I didn't find that you really have a lot of fun until you get designated and get into the fleet, and then you know the pressure is off. You don't have to worry about going back and swabbing decks on a ship if you bust out. But I enjoyed the time immensely there, and then pretty soon, I guess about a year after I was there, we transitioned into the H-34, and then I got individual orders to go to Okinawa, where I joined MAG 36. This was actually about 1960, must have been about 61. And of course, Vietnam had not geared up at that time. I spent a tour on Okinawa, and then I came back to New River this time and was continued to fly the H-34 in one of the operating squadrons at New River. And then we formed up Squadron 262, which was a transition squadron at some point along the way, and we were transitioning fixed-wing pilots into helicopters because the Marine Corps was beginning to expand its helicopter operations.
And at what point did you get into the Vietnam War?
I went through my normal progression in the Marine Corps, several different tours in several different places. Wound up out at El Toro as the communications officer, base communications officer, and I got enough hours in my college, because I only had 2 years of college, and I went to night classes and became eligible for the bootstrap program. It's a leave of absence from the Marine Corps just to pursue your education if you can get within 1 year of getting a degree. And I went to Cal State Fullerton, completed my degree there, got my orders from the bootstrap program to HMM 364, stationed at Santa Ana, and it was forming up to go to Vietnam as a unit. And we trained for, I guess, about 6 months. squadron came together, personnel arrived, airplanes arrived, and actually most of our airplanes, in fact all of our airplanes, we went back to the factory and flew brand new CH-46 Deltas right from the factory, the first Deltas. We had new airplanes loaded up on the ship with the airplanes and an advance party, and the rest of us got on a C-141 and flew over to Da Nang. Our aircraft was still on the ship for about a month.
Then did you fly these helicopters off the ship and into Kiha, or where did you go?
Well, we went to Fubai, and that's an interesting story itself. We got off, and although they had pressed us, hurry up, you got to get to Vietnam. They need you very badly. Go. We can't extend your training anymore. We know you haven't been to the rifle range like you need to, but you got to go. Just go. We got over there, and the wing says, "What are you doing here?" Well, we're 364. We're here, to fight the war. And they said, "Well, take your airplanes and go up to Fubai. We're going up there. We don't have any airplanes." They said, "Oh, you don't have any airplanes? Why are you here without any airplanes? They're on the ship. They're on their way over." Well, okay, go on up to Fubai and get settled in up there, and we'll figure out what to do. Well, it so happened that HMM 163 flying 34s was folding the flag, and we took their assets and the pilots who were not ready to rotate yet, and we incorporated the 34s into HMM 364. And those of us who had some experience in H-34s, we got about 10 hours of orientation around the area to show us where everything was. And then they designated as hacks, and we started flying the H-34s for the next month until our aircraft arrived in the end of October.
So now you're at Fubai, and this is your first time having to live in the country in a war zone. Tell us what your daily life was like, and you had some squadron duties and things like that. Tell us what your life was like.
Yeah, well, when we first got there, they weren't prepared for us, obviously. They didn't know where to put us. There were no hardback tents and no hangars, nothing. So we drew some GP tents and some tents for us to operate out of and to live in. And we set up in a mud hole is what it was, because it was now raining a lot. You get out, we put matting under the tents as best we could, but we didn't have enough for all of them. So we'd get up in the morning and get our mildewed shoes out or boots out and put them on, step up to about ankle deep in mud. And the maintenance shops were doing the same thing, operations was doing the same thing. And we did have a little hard matting, old Marston matting, to park the helicopters on. And it would rain, and then it would quit, and the sun would come out and blister the area. And you could go out and you would be getting wet all over, and you'd come back and there'd be stirred up dust in your eyes. It was absolutely miserable. And CBs came in and came over and started building out some huts on the other side of the runway, and we eventually moved over there. I think it took about a month to do that.
What type of a job did you have in the squadron other than flying, when you weren't flying?
Yeah, I was assistant operations officer for training when we were forming up in the States, and I maintained that job as we opened up in Vietnam. And after a while, we came over very heavy. We had something like, I think, 28 aircraft. And we had the complement of personnel to accommodate 28, but powers that be knew we weren't going to keep all those airplanes. So not too long after we got there, we started transferring people out and sort of mixing the dates that people were going to have to leave country, and so that everybody didn't leave all at one time. And so we were very top heavy. We got in country, and we had a lot of people who were on the waiting list for major, myself included. And pretty soon after we got there, some of those people started getting promoted, and we had majors all over the place. We started transferring a lot of people out, And I maintained for a while assistant operations for training. And as the moves continued, I became the logistics officer, S4 officer.
First combat missions.
Well, as I mentioned, the first 10 hours or so was flying as co-pilot for somebody else. But my first mission as an aircraft commander in combat was in the H-34. And since it was my first one, I was going to get a sort of a soft mission to ease myself into it. And I thought, this is great. It was a VIP trip. You can't get any softer than that. The Huey was going to pick up General Bruno Hochmuth over at his command, which was across the runway, 3rd Mardil, and he was going to go out and visit some of the outlying units. And so I cranked up, and the Huey cranked up. I wasn't even going to have to navigate. Just follow the Huey, and you're going to be okay. And so they made a little recon run down the road to check things out. Came back, and we both launched. The general was in his bird with part of his staff. And first stop was up at the MACV compound in Hue City. And we shut down. The general went in, did his business, came back out, and we fired up and off up towards Quang Tri area. We got about 3 or 4 miles out of Hue, climbed up to 1,500 feet above the small arms fire, and I was in a sort of a loose trail behind the Huey. And to my horror, the Huey blew up in midair. It just blew up right behind the engine compartment, right underneath the rotor system. The troop compartment and everything, the rotors went flying up, debris went out in all directions, and the Huey nosed over like this, went inverted into a rice paddy, a flooded rice paddy. Everybody aboard was obviously killed. I called the control agency, DASC, and told them, our position and what had happened, and to send somebody out to secure the area. We went down and we circled all around the area. The paddy was flooded, so we really couldn't land right. And we hovered around. The crew chief got out into waist deep water, tried to find some survivors. There were none. He found a floating helmet and brought that back in. And we saw there was nothing there we could do, and we wasn't sure what brought it down. And so we went back up then to 1,500 feet and awaited the arrival of some help that came out. And then we went back to the Fubai.
Was the general on your aircraft?
No, the general was in the Huey.
So he was killed.
He was killed. Our only purpose
was to follow him?
To follow them, and to, if anything went wrong, we were to pick the crew up and bring them to safety. And so.
Let's move over to the 46s. Now you got a D model. You're out there flying combat mid.
My first exposure with the D model, before I even got in it, back at Santa Ana, one was coming in for a landing on the big circular mat out at Santa Ana, and just before it touched down, it broke in half, and one piece went this way and one piece went that way, and needless to say, it caused a lot of anxiety during our training cycle. And we obviously they got the fix on it. It took a while. We were grounded for a while in our training cycle until they came up with a fix to reinforce the Station 410, which is where the thing was coming apart.
The 46s come into Vietnam.
Right. And we arrived, and of course, we were the only people who had the 46 Delta model, which sort of placed us in a position of flying up into the Quai Son mountainous area because we could carry the load up there, and the Alphas struggled up at the higher altitude and the humidity and heat that was involved. So we started flying up into that area a lot, although at times, like most squadrons, I think, we flew all over northern I Corps to augment different operations that were going on. But primarily we flew up in the Quezon and along the DMZ.
Tell me about an operation when all the training that you had up to this point, all the training really came into play, the response time that you had when you were in combat.
Well, it sort of evolved as we got experience and learned more about the limitations and the capabilities of our helicopters. That's a learning process. If you don't continue to learn as you go along, somewhere you get stagnant and you don't reach the capabilities that you can achieve in your helicopter and yourself personally too. But I guess where it all finally really came together after we had been in country for a while, operating out of Fubai and working the Quezon area. We worked primarily the outlying hills because they had no way of getting supplies except by helicopter. There were no roads. They were out there on a string all by themselves. So initially we started picking up from the logistical support area on the Quezon Combat Base and distributing to the outpost, Hill 881 South, Hill 861, Hill 950, and to some extent Hill 558, which we didn't do a lot of because they did have a truck route out there. But that was a matter of a lot of coordination with the folks on the ground, a lot of coordination with the other pilots, and we carried loads to the limit of our capabilities, and we learned how to fly the H-46 Delta version. We started doing it with internal loads, and we pretty soon found out that that was not really a good idea. We would go up to Hill 881, for instance, and we'd have loads of cargo of ammunition, loads of sea ration internally. The guys would come up out of their trenches and unload, and we would depart. We really began to learn how to fly the H-46 when we started carrying supplies from Quezon Combat Base up to the Hill outpost. And the thing we soon learned was that you shouldn't land in that zone and stay there while people unloaded your helicopter. It was just too dangerous. And it was not only dangerous to our crew, but it was a danger to the people who were up there 24 hours a day taking the incoming rounds. So we quickly came to a realization that we needed to find a way not to do that. And we started working then with almost exclusively cargo nets, external loads. There were some things you had to do internally. You had to take the medevacs out. You had to bring replacements in. That had to be internally, of course, but for the most part, it was all cargo nets externally.
I asked you what the happiest or funniest time you had flying 46s or 34s with 364.
Well, I guess the happiest thing is not just one incident. It was the opportunity to fly with the caliber of pilots and crew members that I was privileged to fly with. You take so much for granted when you're in a training operation and you fix base somewhere in the continental U.S. But when you get down to a situation in combat, you learn what's inside of people, and they learn what's inside of you. And the kind of people that I was flying with were very experienced. They were humble and competent and proficient and funny. And it was just a brotherhood that was so much fun to fly with and be with, and one that you could trust. I never worried about what my wingman was going to do. I knew what he was going to do. And I never concerned myself with what the crew chief was going to do and how he was going to respond if we had a situation we needed to deal with. And that's a very comforting feeling. It's such a rewarding thing. The mission that we flew was rewarding because we began to understand why we had been training for all these years to do exactly what we were doing then. And we were compelled to do it well because they deserve no better or no less.
You talked earlier about dark humor. Tell me a little bit about it.
Well, we obviously there's a lot of pressure to flying in combat, particularly during the Khe Sanh siege that we were involved in, and Hue City and the Tet Offensive, and it showed. Most of the pilots lost from 20 to 30 pounds during that time frame, and it was because we didn't have time to eat. We'd get up early in the morning, go on numerous missions, come back late at night, and we very seldom were able to eat a regular meal in the mess hall. But you had to do something to relieve the stress, and we did it with dark humor, a lot of that. And I remember on one occasion that, and actually it happened on several occasions, not exactly that way, but there were some missions you knew that it was just a bad place, and it was an opportunity for the crew not to come back. Recon extracts where they were surrounded and on the run, and couldn't break contact. And frequently when that would happen, there would be people around the ready room, and they launched the bald eagle or launched the recon extract, and the pilots who were up next or were standing that standby would get up and start writing notes, and a couple of pilots would get up and stand around and say, hey, Denny, can I have your radio? And the other guy would say, no, I already spoke. It's my radio. You got something else. We're going to take the radio here, and then get into this back and forth about who was going to get what when he didn't come back. And it was all in good humor, and it sort of was a way to relieve things. Now, hopefully it helped the guy who was going out to see things in a light that was a little different.
There are instances where fear takes over, but it's not usually during the operation. It's usually after the operation when it hits you, what you've just accomplished. Tell us about how you handled fear during the time you were flying.
I think during our time there, I don't know if we call it fear or anxiety, probably some of both, but there were a couple of recon extracts that I can recall where there was fear, and you cannot feel that fear, and I don't think you actually do while you're concentrating on the mission. I know that I'm hearing other people talk, you're focused in a very small area. How do I get in? How do I get out? How do I get those folks on board? And how do we make everything come together so that this is successful? Nothing else makes any difference at that point. So you're so absorbed in trying to make everything happen just the way it's got to happen. So there's no other feeling involved in it whatsoever. At least that's my experience. Once you get out of the zone and airborne, then is when you start thinking about the things that could have gone wrong. And when you get back to the base and you sit there and you get back to your hooch and you start running as you always run a mission, not to quell your fear, I don't think, but to see if there's anything I learned there that I can use the next time I'm out to make sure that I bring my crew home and that I accomplish the mission. So you do analyze it. I don't care what people say, you analyze it. And at that point, then you start feeling, it's a feeling right in here of anxiety, or sometimes it even reaches nausea. It did when I came back from that flight when General Hockmuth and his folks were killed. I just got so nauseous, I just had to get by myself. And it's then when those kind of things take place. You know you don't need to do that in front of the crew or while the mission is going on, but it's in there and it's got to come out. It really does.
Now I'm going to ask you about your worst experience in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell me, just go ahead and lead into it any way you want.
The crash of Yankee Kilo 13, Lenny Demko and his crew, Jack Burke, Corporal Connor, Corporal Copeland, Sergeant Shelton, Lenny was a good friend of mine. He was in the bunk next to me, and he was a very reserved sort of person. He didn't open up easily, but he was a very competent pilot, and he was a very courageous pilot. He was the medevac standby that day, and his crew. And they had flown several medevac missions that turned out well. And he got called for one in Hue City. And at that time, Hue City was just absolute total confusion. You didn't know who was shooting where, what was happening. The only thing you did know that the North Vietnamese were in control of everything except a few small pockets within Hue City. He got the call to go, and it was overcast and low clouds and fog like it frequently was during that time frame. You couldn't go up and come down, no nav aids out there. So the only choice was to go under the clouds and through the fog and the rain, which he did. You get as close to the clouds as you can, or you get right down on the ground and you scoot as fast as you can. And that's what he was doing. About halfway there, he took some rounds through the helicopter. Among the first rounds, it took out the corpsman. One went through his hip and incapacitated him. And Lenny asking, okay, do we need to go back? He said, no, the crew chief, the gunner can put a splint on me and I'll be okay. We need to get these people out. What courage is that? And so Lenny said, okay, we'll continue. And he got a little closer in, very close to picking up the Marines. And they took another series of small arms fire through it. This one hit one of the crew chief, and he was back there. The corpsman, who had a splint on and a shattered hip, was patching up and putting a splint on the crew chief. And while he was doing that, they were back on close to the back of the ramp. And while they were doing that, they took yet another devastating small arms fire. It obviously hit something very vital. And according to the one witness that survived, the corpsman, that we didn't know that though for many years that he had survived, the aircraft nose pitched up, then came back down, rolled inverted, and rolled into a rice paddy and exploded in all directions. And the rice paddy was flooded with diesel fuel and burning debris. The corpsman, we found out later, had been thrown out the back of the helicopter. He was on the ramp. When it nosed over, he was thrown out the back. He fell about 150 feet into the rice paddy, and the fuel started burning all around him, and he did a maneuver to be able to breathe. And the aircraft that was chasing the Huey, who went as a gunship for the medevac flights, came down and picked him up. And he, not being a member of the squadron, he belonged to the medical battalion. We never knew for several years that he had survived. But that was, it really affected our squadron. And then they went out and brought the wreckage in. The biggest piece was a piece of a charred engine, and laid it out on the mat. And it was a sobering experience for everybody. And you begin to feel, I think, like you haven't been killed in 3 months. I must be indestructible like I always thought I was. And this sort of brought it home. Nobody is indestructible. And there was a lot of pain over this particular instance. And mine was very personal.
I heard a story in here the other night you told, and you were talking about when you got wounded.
Was that the true story, or was that the other one?
Well, I'm not going to say. This is your story. So we're going to listen to your story when you were with Randy Young.
That was my last flight in Vietnam, of course. We were trying desperately to rescue a company of Marines. This was during the Tet Offensive. And of course, there were North Vietnamese all over the countryside. They owned Hue City and most of the provincial capitals, and they were running rampant. We were causing great damage. We were taking our toll on them, but they were determined, and they kept coming. This company of Marines was up on a mountain. They had thought that there was an opportunity to identify a major element of the North Vietnamese up on this mountain. It's actually a ridge line that goes from Hai Van Pass to the west up into the mountains. Very, very rugged country. And they did find what they were looking for, but it was dense jungle, and they found them much too late. They were in the midst of a fortified position, and they took heavy, heavy casualties. They set up the best perimeter they could on the side of the mountain. It was very steep, and triple canopy jungle up to 150 feet. No landing zone anywhere around. They were basically trapped, and no way to anybody to get help to them. The Purple Foxes got that mission assigned to it, and we spent 5 days trying to help those poor brother Marines out there. Each and every time we went in, the small arms fire was so heavy, we wound up sustaining such battle damage we could not stay. Engines were shot out. They hobbled back to the closest base at Marble Mountain or at Phu Bai, and shut that one down. And another one be run in very quickly, and they would get into the same kind of a situation, and just absolutely could not do it. Day 2, it was rainy and foggy, and it was overcast, and the whole area there was in the clouds, and you couldn't find anything. Although we had birds up all day long waiting for just one little break in the fog and rain, it never came. The third day, it was my day. I was due up. I was on the schedule. I got up that morning, and I was scheduled to go out and make another attempt. We were going to load some medical supplies, a chainsaw, and some explosives down on the hoist to hopefully allow them to blow a landing zone or cut a landing zone and get some medical supplies to help treat the wounded Marines. We came in very early in the morning, pretty soon after sunup. The Huey was already out there on station. We had a flight of 246s and a flight of 2 Huey gunships. They were out there making contact. They talked to the guys on the ground. They were still in their perimeter. And although they had moved the perimeter a bit to a better, more advantageous place. And so even the Huey, who had been out there the day before, didn't know precisely where they were. But he did a fly over, and he marked for me. My wingman I told to stay up top. And he marked for me where his best guess was as to where the perimeter was. So we started in that direction, and we found out that most of the fire was coming. They were about maybe 100 meters down from the top of the ridge line, where they had established on another tiny little ridge there, and they were getting fired on from above. And so we elected to come in from the south, which was driving over the valley into the ridge line, and we told them to pop a smoke. That's the only one they had left. And they popped the smoke when we were getting in the vicinity. It never got up above the tree tops. We never saw the smoke. And we told them we didn't see it. Well, we popped it, so it became obvious that we weren't going to see it. So I told the folks on the ground, okay, I'm coming towards you. Guide me in. Tell me whether I'm getting louder or whether I'm to the right or the left, and we'll make this work. And so they did that, and they listened, and they couldn't hear, and they couldn't hear, and they couldn't hear. And then all of a sudden they say, "Stop, you're over us." And so they were able to hear us right after we got there. We settled into a hover right across over the treetops because our hoist we weren't sure was going to be long enough to reach. So we settled right in over the treetops, maybe 5 or 10 feet above them. And we were getting ready to lower the hoist. And I don't think the crew chief ever got it unfurled before the whole skyline out in front of us opened up with automatic weapons fire. And it didn't take but a minute. We didn't have time to decide what to do about it. Among the first rounds that came in, many of them came through the cockpit and through the instrument panel. And the most effective one caught me behind the left knee and went lengthwise up my thigh and exited up in the upper thigh. Unfortunately, it took out the femoral artery as it went through. And we couldn't hover. We started settling into the trees. We were just too heavy to hover. And so the only option was to fall off the mountain. So I kicked hard right rudder and pointed the nose down the mountain to try to get some translational lift so that we could maintain, because one engine was out. If I knew if we could get some translational lift and keep going downhill, we could probably make it work. And so we started doing that, and we were just struggling to stay out of the trees. We were milking turns, as we call it, pulling the collective up. The turns on the rotor would deteriorate. It would get us up 10 or 15 feet. We'd go back down to restore the turns and then pull back up again, hopping along as we went. And we were beginning to gain. We had not reached translational lift, but we were beginning to get there. And my vision began to close in on me. And it got gray. And I was trying to strain to see what systems we had lost and beginning to get ready to shut down the engine. And about that time, it closed in, so I was just looking through a hose, and then it turned gray and closed in. Just before it did, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to do anything beyond that. So I turned to the co-pilot, and I said, "You have the airplane." And he looked over my way, and I shook the controls, as was the signal that I really mean it. If you didn't hear it, I mean it. You got the airplane. He took the controls, and he was on them, as we always brief. Stay on the controls with the pilot. And he took the aircraft, and beyond that, I was just a passenger. Unfortunately, when I passed out, I slumped over the controls, which restricted his movement of the controls, which he desperately needed at that time. And the crew chief ran forward, and Randy Young, he came forward. I should mention Dean Davidge was the co-pilot. Randy Young ran forward, and we were pouring fuel out of the engine area where the engine fuel line had been severed. And Randy recognized that the co-pilot just really did not have time to deal with that. He went up to the cockpit and actually turned the fuel pump off in order to stop that flow of fuel. I believe to this day that probably saved all of our lives, because I don't think that much fuel could continue to pump where it was pumping without a fire going. With all the electrical, there had to be electrical sparks all over the place because we had electrical lights coming on. But the fortunate thing about it, in spite of the fact that we had a lot of inexperienced co-pilots, we at this point we did not. And I'm thankful to Dean Davidge that he was the guy on board that day.
What impact do you think the different units that you served with and in the war itself and have an outcome on the war? How do you think you had any outcome on the war? Any input onto it?
Well, I think down on the lower levels, we probably had no great impact on the overall conduct of the war, although we did not see that as our job. We live in a democracy. our civilian elected officials tell us what is the most important job for us to do. And we are sent to do that job. Ours is not to decide which jobs we're going to do or where we're going to do them, but the military, once they're given a job, does it extremely well. And I think HMM 364 during that time period did it as well as anybody could ever do it. And I think that's the impact we had on the Marines around us, the Marines on the ground, and that was our contribution. Obviously, Quezon was a very strategic place, and we had a very big impact on making sure that it stayed in place and was a strategic advantage to us. So in that respect, yeah, we had an impact on the overall war.
What do you want people to know about this time in history? What would you tell somebody, a young person today? What do you want them to know about that?
I would like them to know that there were and still are young men and women who are willing to give up the easy life for you and me so that we may enjoy the freedoms that we take for granted so many times. And there are sacrifices involved for those people who choose and are willing to do that. And we know what those sacrifices are in our dead comrades, in those who suffer traumatic wounds physically and emotionally. We see the price up close and personal, but the general public does not see that. I would like for them to know that and to understand the sacrifices that are being made on their behalf.
Is there something in this interview that you want to say that we haven't asked you about?
I would probably, if I had time to say something else, I would probably like to let the world know and the helicopter community understand what it was like to fly the Quezon Super Gaggle. The Marine Corps thought enough of the importance of that particular thing that is the theme that's selected out of all other Vietnam themes to be in the Marine Corps Museum. It is a panorama immersion gallery of Hill 881 South with a Purple Fox helicopter sitting in the zone, right? And there is no way to probably understand the complexity of that operation and the skills and the devotion it required to make that mission happen. It came about as a result of the fact that we could not sit in zones. Up in Hill 881, 861, it was not possible. We were getting people on the ground killed, and we were getting people injured in our helicopters. Unacceptable. So someone, and there are a lot of people who will claim the origins of the Super Gaggle. I have no idea. I know that it came to pass. I know that there was a lot of thought put into it. I know a lot of people put a lot of study into how to do it and why we must do it. But the Super Gaggle involved a coordinated effort to reduce the casualties and ensure more in the way of success in getting supplies into those hills. We found out we couldn't do it from Quezon because Quezon, you get both ends shot there. You pick up supplies and you get incoming mortars and artillery. You go out to the hills to deliver them and you get the same thing. It became untenable, particularly during the time when they were getting 1,000 rounds a day into Quezon Combat Base. So the plan was to stage supplies back at Dong Ha, logistics support area. We would do it all in one big gaggle. It was an evolution that started with a weatherbird going out and checking the weather. It was a horrible time of weather. This is the monsoon season. It was always overcast along the coast. It was always overcast, but a lot of times you'd get breaks in the clouds over the mountains of the Quezon area. weather check, launching of fixed wings, several flights of fixed wing aircraft, designation of the hill we were going to take supplies in, 12, 8, 10, 12, 14 CH-46s, 4 Huey gunships, 2 or 3 flights of fixed wing aircraft congregate over Khe Sanh. You think Disney World is something with their light show. You ought to see 4 flights of fixed wing aircraft dropping napalm and Nate and Snake and that sort of thing. It is something to watch and behold. And you look down and says, oh, we are sitting pretty now, because there's nothing that can live through that. Next to the last run was napalm on each side of the hill. The last run was a smoke run by an A4 that smoked the area between Hill 881 South, which we own, and 881 North, just across the trench that they owned. And they had anti-aircraft weapons and mortar positions all set in there, concentrating on that one zone. And so the key was to get in and out in a hurry, get their heads down, destroy as much of the firepower as you can, get their heads down. We'd be orbiting at 1,500 feet over Khe Sanh. When it's time to go, last run, smoke run, down we go with 10 or 12 airplanes in a trail, tight as we could get, with swinging loads, 120 knots, swinging loads. Down you go, and you get in and out as fast as you can. You close up the interval real tight towards the end. The guy's got to drop his load. He better drop it, because if it ain't, some guy's coming up his tail, and he's going to have to go around over that bad guy country and come back and do it again. Getting there, which I failed to mention, you pick up at Don Ha, and 10, 12 airplanes, 46s. Clouds are about 500 feet up there. They're all the way up to sometimes 5,000 to 8,000 feet. You pick up your swinging load, you climb out the first one on this radial, the second one 10 degrees off here, the second one 10 degrees to the right, the next guy 10 degrees this way. By then they're beginning to climb out. The next flight does the same thing with enough interval now not to run into one another. When they first guys clear on top, they call it on top at 6,000 feet. Okay, we all go up on top and everybody's headed to Khe Sanh, and first guys slow down and the other guys catch up, and we orbit over Khe Sanh. Now, if you don't break out on top, what do? You turn around, take different radials back towards Quang Tree. You do a ground controlled approach. Doesn't matter, it's below minimum. Sure it is. Doesn't matter, you gotta land. And that's the way the plan was supposed to work. Fortunately, we never had to come back with a load. We did sometimes have to come back down. We often came back down through the clouds after we dropped our loads and did ground controlled approaches to come in, and that was a thrill within itself. Before I went to Vietnam, I was a fairly experienced helicopter pilot. I had many hours in helicopters. I had never ever practiced to do external loads in the clouds. I never heard anybody mention doing external loads in the clouds. And this is the only time I ever knew that it was done. And it was done by whoever was up for flying that day. And they made it work and got the supplies. There were days when the cloud tops were covering Hill 881, 861. I have seen pilots find a hole. There's no fixed wing, it can't do anything. Find a hole, a little tiny hole, go down through it, everybody right behind him, get underneath, look around. I recognize that valley. They go up the valley and they get there and the hilltop is in the clouds, you can't see it. Turn around and come back, not hardly. Right down over the treetops, hover up to the zone that you can't see, drop the load. When you find the drop zone, out you go, the next guy up doing the same thing. I never heard of such a thing. As they would come down through this tiny little hole in the clouds, 10 or 12 CH-46s. One guy would find the hole and everybody else would follow him down. They get down below and they look around at when they broke out at the bottom of it, the clouds were still very low. They recognize a valley that goes up towards 881. And they start the train up towards 881, hoping that hopefully we can get in there. They need this water. They hadn't had water in 2 days. And up we go, and you get up to near the crest of 881, and it's raining and you can't see very well, foggy. And your heart drops because it's in the clouds. And I have seen more than once these courageous pilots that I was privileged to fly with hover over the trees and hover up towards that zone. They'd been there many times, so they knew about where it was. Up they go, looking down to keep clear of the trees until they found the perimeter, up into the perimeter, look around to find the drop area, drop the zone, and another man right behind them doing exactly the same thing. 10, 12 aircraft in this murk up there trying to find the zone and then getting out of the zone. And such courage and devotion I have never seen, never will again, I'm quite sure. Those are the folks I flew with.
Politics were going on all around us. We didn't always think about it and everything, but then we came back home into it and all that other stuff, all that stuff that was surrounding the Vietnam War. And so what was your take on the whole political side of the thing?
Well, while I was in country, and I think maybe that was the case with most of the operating squadrons, we didn't have a TV, we didn't have a radio, thankfully. A few people had a radio that about the only thing you'd get was Hanoi Hana, and everybody knew that was propaganda. So we did not concern ourselves with the politics. We had a mission to do, and it was a very difficult mission, and that's what we were there for. The politics were beyond our pay grade, and we couldn't do anything about it. It wasn't our responsibility to do anything about it. Those of us who had seen it before we came over understood that there was a lot of dissatisfaction regarding the war. It was not our place to try to sort it out. We had a job to do and we did it. Coming back, it was a little tough for a lot of people. You go over and leave your family, you expose yourself to horrible living conditions, you expose yourself to a fairly deadly enemy every day for your country. And in most cases, it boils down to even more than that for your fellow man on the right and on the left. It's a survival thing. But your primary purpose of being there was to serve your country. And so we didn't get involved. When you came back and you had done all of this for your country and you arrive in the U.S. And they tell you need to pull off your uniform because it's going to get ugly from here down to San Francisco airport, and you might just want to get out of your uniform. And that's sort of devastating for a Marine. He's been proud of that uniform for a very long time. He just did what he thought was great sacrifices that his country asked him to do, and now his country rejects him when he comes back. Most of us are smart enough to realize it was not their country rejecting him, it was a group of people who had an agenda and who felt very strongly about the war, and they got a lot of press on it. We knew that there were a lot of people who supported us, and supported maybe not even those who didn't support the war, probably supported those people who were making the sacrifices. So those of us who were fortunate enough to stay in the Marine Corps after that, we had a support group around us. We had other Marines that we worked next to every day. What I really felt for was those people who came back were kicked out in society without the coping skills to deal with that kind of adversity, and I think it took a real toll on them.
Any last thoughts that you want to throw at us here?
Well, I had a lot of last thoughts there, didn't I?
But you did a great interview. Just if there's any last minute things that you thought of that you want to throw in here, or Do you want to end it any certain way, or we're just done?
Well, I don't know of anything else that I could say or add to it. If you have anything you
Do you want to mention anything about family support during all this time or anything like that?
Well, I probably should do that because that's a very important aspect of it.
Go ahead.
Good.
In spite of all the controversy surrounding the war, our families suffered probably as much as, or maybe sometimes more than we did because we were very busy doing our job in Vietnam. The families were back home looking at horrible television about the body bags that were being hauled out of Vietnam and wondering if that's my husband or my son, and not being able to find out anything except what the media chose to show them. And on a personal note, when General Hockmuth was killed, and I happened to be the chase pilot, all the networks descended upon the tent back in the area, and we conducted an interview with CBS and all the other folks who were there, who were trying to basically lead you on that this is a horrible war and people get killed and somebody killed a general and this sort of thing. And we had the interview. My wife knew nothing of this, of course, until some local reporter picked it up off the wires and called her and said, there's a general who died in Vietnam and your husband was involved. And she was, at that time, she was very pregnant with one of our children. And it was very hard on her. And she couldn't find out anything. Nobody had called her. Nobody had told her. And of course, I was not injured, so there was no need for the Marine Corps to call. But this insensitive reporter had the unmitigated gall to call her and tell her that her husband was involved in an incident where people were killed. And it had a horrifying effect on her.